Members, the committee is resumed and we are on the House is in committee on the Reserve Bank of New Zealand Covered Bonds Amendment Bill. Point of order, Tim McIndoe.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I seek leave for the committee to take all parts, schedules and clauses of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand Covered Bonds Amendment Bill as one question.
Leave is sought for that purpose. Is there any objection? There is no objection. The question then is that parts 1 and 2, the schedule and clauses 1 to 3 stand part. Call Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr Chair. It's my pleasure to give a contribution in the committee stages of the Reserve Bank of Bank of New Zealand Covered Bonds Amendment Bill. Labour will be giving its support to this bill. We do have some reservations, though, in giving that support, but we will traverse that over the course of this debate. Now, the purpose of this bill, well, obviously covered bonds are debt securities issued by a financial entity, but at the moment the legislative framework for covered bonds in New Zealand is somewhat lacking. So opposing this legislation, and this is something that Labour has considered in giving its support, opposing this legislation will not prevent the issuance of covered bonds, but it would leave New Zealand without regulation, and we would be concerned by that situation, one of the reasons that we are giving it support with reservations. So to cover the purpose of this bill briefly, given we're at the beginning of committee stages, the key feature of a covered bond is that bondholders have both an unsecured claim over the issuing entity and hold a secured interest over a specific pool of assets called the cover pool. Now, New Zealand banks have been active in issuing covered bonds over the last 2 years, and this has been carried out under contractual arrangements. However, most jurisdictions, and we often look to jurisdictions like Australia when assessing whether or not we're keeping up with the play in terms of jurisdictions who are similar to us. Most jurisdictions with banks active in the covered bond market, and that includes Australia, now have a legislative framework for issuance in place. Now, the lack of a similar legislative framework does put New Zealand issuers at a disadvantage, and so that's one of the reasons why obviously this bill has been brought. So the bill establishes a legislative framework for covered bonds, the purpose of which is to improve financial stability by ensuring that New Zealand banks have effective access to the covered bond market as a source of long-term, relatively stable finance as an alternative source of bank funding. But the main problem that has been identified, obviously, which we're trying to remedy with this bill, is the lack of certainty over the effectiveness of legal arrangements to segregate both the cover pool assets from the assets of an issuing bank. So that's something that this bill is trying to address. But the second problem that this bill seeks to address is to ensure that there's an adequate level of independent monitoring of information provided by issuers on cover pool assets. And so the three things that we're likely probably to debate in these committee stages are first, the requirement that covered bonds issued by New Zealand banks be registered, subject to meeting registration requirements. B, the independent monitoring of cover pools by an asset monitor. And C, provisions to amend the Act, including the Companies Act, to clarify the treatment of registered cover bonds in the event of issuer insolvency. Now, I think anyone would agree that in this current state environment, in the state of our financial markets in the past few years, that regulation is better than the absence of regulation, hence Labour lending its support to this bill, because to not do that would mean a continuation of the status quo where we have an ad hoc arrangement, contractually based as I understand it, and when we have, that leaves us at a disadvantage when we're looking to comparable jurisdictions like Australia. But that doesn't mean that just simply a regulation in its current form necessarily is going to to tick off all the boxes that we would be looking for, all of the acid tests that we would have for legislation such as this. And my colleagues who have been involved in this area a little more closely, I'm sure, will traverse some of that in their contributions. Some of the things that, though, we're likely also to cover is that the effect of covered bonds currently is to create a class of lenders to banks who have a higher level of security over banks compared to other lenders, and there is unfairness in that it creates a two-tier system. Most covered bond holders are foreign institutions. So the question is, where does this leave mum and dad investors, as we've so frequently heard about?
Dr. David Clark.
This issue